After 5 years of careful fixing and repairs, Buckingham Palace is getting ready to open the doors to its East Wing for the first time ever. And we got the first peek inside. This is where the king and royal family members step out onto the most famous balcony in the entire world. Buckingham Palace amazes everyone with its shiny golden hallways, old treasures, and perfect royal image. But behind all that fancy stuff is a story almost nobody hears about. The struggles of the maids who kept everything running smoothly. They dealt with crazy rules, really low pay, and lives lived under non-stop watching, all while staying invisible to everyone outside. When they left, it wasn't just quitting their jobs. They were quietly rebelling against a system that cared more about appearances than actual people. So what really made them leave? Stick with us as we reveal the truth behind those golden gates. Buckingham Palace is a name that immediately makes you think of fancy decorations, old traditions, and power. Tourists from all over the world come just to get even a quick look at its gleaming front. They're amazed by the tall gates, the shiny guards in red uniforms, and the huge size of a home that's been a symbol of royalty for hundreds of years. To regular people, it represents a fairy tale. Golden light fixtures, never-ending hallways, and the magic of royal history happening in every room. But for the people who worked behind those golden gates, things looked really different. Underneath those chandeliers and marble floors was a place ruled by strict discipline, ranking systems, and unwritten rules. It was a place where workers were expected to move quietly, blend into the background, and still do their jobs perfectly. Every sweep of a broom, every polished railing, every folded towel carried the weight of tradition. And behind all the glamour, these small actions meant the difference between getting approval or getting in trouble. Former palace workers have shared that what looked like a dream job to outsiders often turned into endless hard work. The palace's beauty only stayed that way through incredible effort, really long hours, and constant alertness. Mess-ups were almost never forgiven, and the expectations left almost no room for personal comfort. The grand hallways that amazed visitors became daily reminders to staff that perfection wasn't a choice, it was required. To many of the maids, Buckingham Palace was way more than just a workplace. It was like a stage where everything they did was watched, examined, and judged. Unlike the tourists who took pictures and left, the staff lived this reality every single day. And for some, the price of keeping up this royal image eventually became more than the pride of working inside. Britain's most famous building, the palace might have been the jewel of the monarchy. But inside its walls, quiet complaints got louder over time. Behind all the grandeur and order was a question that even the palace couldn't silence. What was really making loyal staff walk away from such a high-status job? But if the palace's dazzling beauty came at such a high price for the people who worked inside, what invisible burden were the maids really carrying? Stay tuned. The answer might surprise you: the unbelievable pressure the maids faced. When visitors walk into Buckingham Palace, they marvel at the sparkling chandeliers, the fancy furniture, and the polished floors that seem to shine forever. But behind the scenes, the people responsible for keeping everything perfect live a reality few outsiders would want. For the maids, every day was like an exercise in discipline, being exact, and silent suffering. Former staff member Anne Simmons, who spent over 10 years working in the palace's 775 rooms, described a place where nothing was ever left to chance. Cleaning wasn't just about getting rid of dust or making surfaces shiny. It was like a performance, almost like a ceremony. Every mop stroke, every folded cloth, every polishing motion had to meet a standard that wasn't just about doing things efficiently, but about centuries of royal tradition. The tiniest mistake could cause problems way beyond just the maid who made it. A streak left on a window, an unevenly folded towel, or a scuff mark missed on a stairway could bring quick scoldings. In a place where fancy decorations define what the public sees, Even small mistakes were treated as big failures. For the maids, paying attention to details wasn't just encouraged. It was demanded. The work needed a balance of speed and perfection. Cleaning solutions had to be mixed to exact amounts, clothes folded to exact shapes, and mops wrung out just right. There was no room for taking shortcuts. Everything had meaning, from picking the right tools to the rhythm of movements. Cleaning here wasn't just a job. It was tradition in action, keeping the palace's image as the crown jewel of Britain, on top of the physical strain. There was the constant pressure of being watched. Maids were rarely alone. Senior staff checked their work closely. Visitors walked through the hallways, and members of the royal family could show up unexpectedly. At any moment, good work might get noticed, but mistakes could too. Living under constant observation meant that staying calm and quiet became automatic. Simmons revealed that discipline eventually became a way of life. To succeed, staff had to figure out what was needed before anyone said it. Work quickly without rushing, and stay invisible yet essential. It was a balancing act that left little room for rest, yet made sure the palace's legacy stayed perfect. Buckingham Palace's beauty wasn't an accident. It was built on the backs of maids who carried pressure that few outsiders could ever imagine. But if this much stress surrounded even the simplest tasks, what other hidden rules controlled their daily lives? Keep watching, because the next revelation might leave you shocked. The super strict cleaning rules. If the pressure of working at Buckingham Palace wasn't enough, the rules about how cleaning should be done added another layer of intensity. Every task, from dusting an old vase to scrubbing a sink, was surrounded by strict rules that left no room for doing things your own way. To people outside, wiping down a table might seem simple. But inside the palace, even that could be a test of discipline. Anne Simmons, who worked more than 10 years as a maid, described how everyday products that you'd find under the kitchen sink in most homes were strictly not allowed inside the palace walls. Something as normal as disposable wet wipes was completely banned. Even though they're sold as flushable, they caused repeated problems for the palace's old and complicated plumbing system. Repairs were expensive, and the hassle of clogs could not be tolerated. But there was another reason behind the ban: sustainability. King Charles, who's been known for a long time for caring about the environment, supported the ban. Instead, staff were required to use reusable cloths, which were not only gentler on the palace's delicate surfaces, but also fit with the monarchy's commitment to protecting nature. Even tools had to pass a test of tradition and usefulness. Steel wool, for example, was strictly forbidden. The risk of scratching marble, granite, or stainless steel was considered too high. Instead, maids used microfiber cloths and gentle natural solutions like lemon juice, vinegar, and warm water, carefully mixed to just the right strength. These homemade mixes made sure surfaces gleamed, without leaving harmful residue behind. The rules might have sounded extreme to outsiders, but inside the palace, they were seen as necessary protectors of history. Every item used, whether a mop, a cloth, or a bottle of solution, was picked with the same care that went into preserving priceless paintings and antique furniture. Cleaning wasn't just upkeep. It was preservation. Yet these strict standards put huge strain on the staff. Each action had to be done perfectly. A cloth folded the wrong way, a solution mixed too strong, or a scratch left behind on polished wood could have consequences that went way beyond the immediate task. Mistakes weren't just personal failures. They risked hurting the palace's reputation for flawless grandeur, and often described her role as walking a tightrope. Balance was everything. Speed versus being exact. Being discreet versus being visible. Efficiency versus care. A single wrong step could ripple through the household, noticed not only by supervisors, but sometimes even by the royals themselves. For the maids, there was no such thing as a small detail. Over time, these rigid practices turned cleaning into something much bigger. It became an art form where loyalty, patience, and discipline were shown in every sweep and polish. But this chase for perfection also created unbearable stress. Many maids started to question if the honor of working inside Buckingham Palace was worth what it demanded. And if the rules for cleaning were this strict, what was life like for the people who had to live and work inside the palace every single day? Keep watching Life Inside Buckingham Palace. For regular people, Buckingham Palace often seems like the ultimate dream workplace. With its glittering chandeliers, sweeping staircases, and rooms soaked in history. Many imagine that working there must feel like stepping into a fairy tale. To wear the uniform, walk the hallways, and serve around royalty sounds like an honor given to only a chosen few. Yet for the people who lived and worked behind its towering gates, the everyday experience was way less magical. Anne Simmons, a former maid who dedicated more than 10 years of her life to the palace, described it not as a home or even an office, but as a kind of living museum. Every hallway, every dining room, every artifact carried centuries of history, and with it came the huge responsibility of preservation. Tasks that might seem routine anywhere else were elevated to almost ritual status inside the palace. Dusting a table wasn't just about making it shine. It was about protecting delicate surfaces that might be hundreds of years old. A wrongly chosen cloth or too much pressure while polishing could mean permanent damage in this world. Even a small error could ripple through the household, raising questions not only about the individual staff member, but also about the palace's reputation as a symbol of perfection. Life inside Buckingham Palace meant living with constant awareness. Staff knew they weren't only serving the royal family, but also protecting the monarchy's image. Every hallway had to gleam, every mirror had to sparkle, and every flower arrangement had to be precise. Maids moved quietly, often unseen. Yet the impact of their work was on display every moment. The palace's grandeur, admired by millions of tourists and important visitors, depended on their WATCHFULNESS. Discipline was woven into the fabric of everyday life. There was little room for improvising or taking shortcuts. Cleaning products had to be carefully measured. Cloths folded a certain way. Movements practiced until they became automatic. Simmons remembered how even the choice of natural cleaning solutions, lemon, vinegar, and warm water, was based not just on what worked, but on tradition. These methods were safer for fragile materials, but they also reinforced the idea that nothing inside the palace was ordinary. Working in this kind of place brought a strange mix of pride and pressure. On one hand, the staff were surrounded by a world most people could only dream about. They handled priceless artifacts, worked in historic rooms, and sometimes caught glimpses of the royals themselves. For many, the sense of privilege was undeniable. But the flip side of this privilege was suffocating control. Every step had rules. Every action was monitored, even when no one could see. Staff knew that mistakes could be noticed at any time by supervisors, by guests, or even by a passing royal. The result was a culture of constant watchfulness. A hallway swept too quickly, a chair polished unevenly, or a single object out of place could undo hours of effort. To outsiders, these might seem like small oversights. Inside the palace, they were treated as failures of duty. For the staff, the line between success and failure was razor thin. This duality, honor mixed with relentless expectation, defined daily life inside Buckingham Palace. Employees carried the rare privilege of serving in one of the world's most iconic homes, yet bore the unseen burden of upholding traditions that left no room for human error. Beneath the grandeur that captivated visitors was a disciplined system where precision, hierarchy, and respect for rules controlled every moment. For Anne Simmons and her co-workers, this was the hidden reality of palace life. a constant balancing act between pride and pressure, where beauty and elegance were kept up by an invisible web of rules that demanded nothing short of perfection. The Queen's Kitchen. Behind the velvet curtains and grand hallways of Buckingham Palace is a place that rarely shows up in photographs. It keeps the royal household going every single day. The Queen's Kitchen. Far from a normal cooking space, it was a world defined by discipline, restraint, and a level of precision that few chefs anywhere in the world would ever face. Darren McGrady, who once worked as Queen Elizabeth II's personal chef, remembered that preparing food here was never just about taste. Each dish was a statement, an act of loyalty to the monarchy and a show of respect for centuries of tradition. Mistakes weren't just frowned upon. They risked messing up the balance of an institution built on ritual and image. The choice of ingredients alone showed how the kitchen mirrored the palace's broader atmosphere of control. Food was often gotten from royal estates like Balmoral, bringing to the table not just food, but a sense of connection to the land the monarch ruled over. Salmon from Scottish rivers, venison from the estate, freshly picked berries and vegetables grown in carefully maintained royal gardens all carried symbolic weight. These weren't just ingredients, they were heritage. Each had to be prepared in a way that highlighted its natural beauty and emphasized the Queen's long-standing appreciation for Britain's farming gifts. Yet, just as some items were prized, others were completely forbidden. Garlic, for instance, never crossed the palace threshold. In most kitchens around the world, it's a staple ingredient, but inside Buckingham Palace, its strong smell was considered unsuitable for royal dining. For chefs, this meant constantly holding back, setting aside creativity to follow rules that often went against their cooking instincts. Flavor experiments, bold spices, or personal touches had to take a back seat to tradition and protocol. Presentation was equally non-negotiable. Every plate had to be arranged with mathematical precision. A garnish slightly out of place, a sauce spread unevenly, or an overcooked element could easily be seen as disrespectful, not just careless. In this kitchen, taste alone wasn't enough. The dish had to look impeccable, carry symbolic weight, and meet the exacting standards of royal dining. For McGrady and his fellow staff, this environment demanded constant alertness. Every action, from chopping vegetables to plating desserts, was done under watchful eyes. Errors didn't just risk disappointing a diner. They had implications for the palace's reputation. To mess up was to fail not only the Queen, but the monarchy itself. Working in the kitchen was both a privilege and a burden. Few chefs could claim to have cooked for royalty. Yet the suffocating level of control meant that personal ambition was constantly pushed down. Service, tradition, and flawless execution came first, leaving little space for individuality in many ways. The Queen's Kitchen was a small version of Buckingham Palace itself. Outwardly glamorous, inwardly relentless. The pressure was constant, the rules unwavering, and the expectations absolute. For some, the honor was worth the sacrifice. For others, it became a reason to walk away. But if the kitchen was this unforgiving, did the rewards truly match the burden? Stay tuned. The truth about their pay might be the most shocking revelation yet. The shocking truth about Buckingham Palace's hidden pay. The grandeur of Buckingham Palace suggests wealth beyond measure. Marble staircases, gold-covered ceilings. Priceless art. For people who admire it from outside, working inside such walls should mean prestige and privilege. But for many maids and housekeepers, the reality was way more sobering. The pay just didn't match the palace's image. The truth became impossible to ignore when a leave-in, housekeeper, job posting made headlines. The advertised yearly salary was £19,900. At first glance, it might seem reasonable, especially with meals and housing included. But the details revealed something troubling. The hourly rate worked out to just £7.97. less than the legal minimum wage for workers over 22. Deduction rules allowed the palace to count lodging against wages, a technicality that kept pay low while keeping up the appearance of being legal. The announcement caused outrage. Critics called the figure insulting, especially when compared against the huge wealth of the monarchy. Unions condemned it as a glaring example of undervaluing workers. Loyalty to the crown packaged as privilege, while real financial recognition lagged. Behind, the palace defended itself, saying the posting was a mistake and that the full compensation package, including pension contributions, was competitive for live-in jobs in London. But this explanation fell flat for many. After all, what good is free housing if you're still underpaid for the sheer level of discipline? Secrecy and expertise demanded. The comparison with other royal households around the world made the picture even starker. In Denmark, staff at Amalienborg Palace reportedly earn wages closer to national averages without heavy deductions for housing. In the Netherlands, household staff enjoy contracts aligned with union standards, offering both financial security and protection. Even in Monaco, where living costs soar, workers serving the princely household are paid at levels considered fairer for their workload. Against this backdrop, Buckingham Palace, perhaps the most famous royal residence in the world, appeared to lag behind. For the people working inside, the frustration wasn't just about money. It was the imbalance between expectation and reward. Maids were expected to live by strict rules, constantly on call, and responsible for maintaining irreplaceable heritage. They gave up personal freedom, lived under surveillance, and followed traditions that allowed no mistakes. Yet the financial return hardly reflected the sacrifices required. Some endured, driven by the honor of serving the monarchy. Others quietly walked away, deciding that prestige couldn't pay bills or ease exhaustion. In the end, the palace's polished halls concealed a jarring contradiction. A workplace that demanded loyalty as if it were priceless, while offering pay that often felt anything but. And if pay was this low, what other sacrifices were demanded? Stay tuned, because at Buckingham Palace, loyalty costs far more than money. The invisible sacrifices. For Anne and co-workers who worked inside Buckingham Palace, the cost of the job wasn't measured only in pounds and pence. It was measured in time, privacy, and the erosion of personal freedom. Life as a maid meant more than long hours. It meant existing in a world where work and life merged into one, leaving little space for being yourself. Living on site inside the palace sounded like a privilege to outsiders. But for staff, it often felt like a fancy cage. Being provided with housing came with strings attached. You were never truly off duty. A knock at the door late at night could summon a maid to handle an unexpected task. A sudden change in royal plans could mess up personal schedules without warning. Days blurred into nights, and the rhythm of life was dictated not by personal choice, but by the demands of the royal household. Privacy was another sacrifice. Maids lived in staff quarters where being discreet was essential and personal conversations could easily be overheard. Every action, even outside working hours, risked being examined by coworkers or supervisors. There was little room for expressing yourself. The uniform, the behavior, even the tone of voice were shaped by palace expectations. For many, this wasn't just employment. It was servitude masked by the grandeur of tradition. Rest was scarce. The sheer amount of work, cleaning endless rooms, preparing for state events, responding to constant shifts in royal schedules, left little time for recovery. Staff were expected to carry themselves with composure, no matter how exhausted they were. Mistakes made when tired weren't forgiven. They were documented. The pressure to appear tireless was as much a rule as the cleaning protocols themselves. And then there was family life. For live-in staff, time with loved ones was limited. Days off were precious but rare, and often overshadowed by the looming possibility of being called back for urgent duties. Birthdays, anniversaries, and personal milestones were sometimes missed. Sacrificed at the altar of royal duty, these invisible costs rarely made headlines. But they defined the experience of those who served behind the palace's golden gates. The world saw glamour, but the staff lived a reality closer to confinement. One where duty overshadowed freedom and loyalty came at a personal price. But were these sacrifices endured willingly? Or were they quietly resented until they pushed people to walk away? Keep watching Whispers of Discontent. In the shadows of its golden halls, Buckingham Palace concealed a truth few outsiders could imagine. The world saw loyalty and order, but behind the grandeur, frustrations were building quietly. The silence of the staff wasn't a sign of happiness. It was survival. Whispers spread in staff quarters, carried between tired coworkers, or shown in the growing number of quiet resignations that could no longer be ignored. Former employees started to share their experiences, exposing the hidden burdens. Some described the exhaustion of endless shifts. Others, the suffocating scrutiny that left them feeling stripped of identity. For many, the palace wasn't just demanding. It was consuming. It wasn't simply a job, one former maid confessed. It was giving up who you were. That feeling echoed in hushed conversations. Service required not only labor but pieces of personal freedom surrendered day after day. Rumors of discontent grew steadily. Stories went around about supervisors punishing the smallest slip-ups or colleagues, breaking down under the strain of constant pressure. The palace demanded invisibility from its staff. Yet the demands themselves made that invisibility impossible. The stress showed itself in their posture, their faces, their lives. For some, leaving became the only act of self-preservation. Resignations, at first scattered, began forming a pattern too clear to ignore. Each one had its own reason. Some left over low pay, others because of lost family time, and many simply because the atmosphere had become unbearable. The palace from the outside appeared timeless and unshaken. But within its walls, the revolving door of staff told a different story. Walking away. One former worker admitted, was the first time I felt free in years. These departures whispered of more than discontent. They hinted at a deeper imbalance, a growing realization that prestige could no longer make up for exhaustion. What had once been considered an honor had for many become a burden too heavy to carry. And so what began as private murmurs of dissatisfaction gradually evolved into something more visible. A quiet exodus that threatened to expose the cost of royal perfection. But what did these departures truly signal for the monarchy itself? Stay tuned to find out the real reason they left. To the world, Buckingham Palace stands as the ultimate symbol of tradition, prestige, and grandeur. Tourists line up at its gates, snapping photos of guards in red uniforms, imagining the glamour of royal life. But for the people who lived and worked behind those golden gates, the picture was far less enchanting. The maids who kept the palace shining weren't driven away by a single complaint. They left because of a web of pressures that, woven together, became unbearable. The rules alone could break even the most disciplined worker. Every movement had to align with centuries of tradition, from how a mop was wrung out to how a cloth was folded. Mistakes weren't small. They were magnified in an environment where perfection was the baseline. Add to this the suffocating sense of being constantly observed by supervisors, visitors, and even members of the royal family. And the palace quickly became more prison than privilege. Then came the question of pay. For all the prestige of working at the world's most famous residence, wages remained shockingly low. Staff who gave up personal freedom, lived under constant scrutiny, and shouldered immense responsibility often earned less than their counterparts in other royal households across Europe. For many, it felt less like a reward and more like exploitation masked by grandeur. But perhaps the greatest sacrifice was personal. Living on site meant always being on call. Privacy was scarce, Family time was limited, and individuality was slowly stripped away by endless rules and expectations. For some, the palace became a place where identity faded into uniformity, where they no longer felt like people, but parts of a machine designed to uphold the monarchy's image. What tied all of these threads, together was the lack of recognition. The world admired the sparkling chandeliers, the immaculate carpets, the flawless staterooms, but rarely thought of the invisible hands that made it possible. The maids were the guardians of royal perfection, yet their work was taken for granted. Over time, the glamour that had once lured them in lost its shine, replaced by fatigue, frustration, and the realization that loyalty came at too high a cost.